What do I think of homage watches? What is luxury? Are Omega and JLC going to lose their loyal customers? You helped me past 10,000 subscribers, so as always, you get to ask the questions and I'll do my very best to answer them. Let's dive in. Before we get started, just FYI, these Q&A videos are quite a bit longer than my usual content, so they are timestamps for your convenience and accessibility. Also, for these longer Q&A videos, I'm doing a bit of a less polished style, less graphics and all that, and I also have fewer takes, so don't kill me if I'm not looking into the camera as much as I usually do. I'm trying to capture my answers in one take, no prep, no retakes, or at least as few as possible, so it's as off the cuff as possible. I hope you enjoy. That's a question you should ask Nico Leonard about. He's likely going to have a better feel for this than me. Having said that, Universal Geneve. I think the fact that Breitling will be relaunching UG will create a bigger demand for those classic UG models. On top of that, I don't see a lot of specific brands becoming highly collectible in the short term. The market has been contracting, prices have begun dropping, and it's not because people are selling their Pateks or APs to buy Vacherons or Chopards. They're just generally in this kind of sell-off phase, and I think things are, for a time at least, going to move towards availability and value, so I don't see collectability being a driving force in the way it has been for the last 5-10 years. I've had a ton of hobbies all my life. I'm not a person that has had like one hobby ever since I was a teenager, like model trains or whatever. When it comes to hobbies, I like to use the example of what I am in a work context. I'm not a specialist, I'm a generalist. I'm good at a lot of things, but I'm not a subject matter expert on any one thing. And this kind of translates into my hobbies. I like getting reasonably good at something, but often I move on to something else that can challenge me either physically or intellectually or personally. So I've run marathons, I've cycled up and down mountains, I've dabbled in photography and a whole lot of other stuff. Right now, my hobby is watches, but the work in recording and editing is also a part of the hobby. I actually love that technical piece as well. What do I think of Steinhart and Hanhart watches? I don't think the two brands are comparable. Hanhart makes their own designs, where Steinhart are best known for their homage watches. As for Hanhart, I think they've got a lot of cool watches. I've been trying to get a 417 in 39mm for the longest time, but it's constantly sold out, and I just refuse to click on the notify me when it's available button, just on principle. But it's on my list, and I periodically check back to see if the white Panda dial version is available. I'm also a huge fan of the red Pusher Piney models, the chunky big boy Primus models, although they're a little bit too big for my taste, but aesthetically they do a lot of things that are very much their own thing, and I respect that. They've got decent movements for the price, and like I said, they have a very Hanhart unique aesthetic, and they're definitely worth a look. Then there's Steinhart. For those of you that don't know Steinhart, here's the cliff notes. They are a small German company that mostly make homage watches, primarily of classic Rolex models, but not only. They have some of their own designs, but it's because of their homages that most people know them. They use different movements, Salita, Le Joux Perret, and a couple of others. I've had a couple in my hands, and they look a lot like the watches they're emulating. They're not built as well as a modern Rolex, but they're built a lot better than the classic Rolexes they are sometimes emulating. I don't think they are unreasonably priced. And then there's the key question, how do I feel about homage watches? I'm fine with them. I don't understand the need to buy fakes, so any watch that says Rolex or Patek on the dial doesn't appeal to me. Steinhart isn't that though. As a watch nerd, I can, for the most part, spot homage fairly quickly, whether it's a Steinhart or a Dissing or whatever. If I can spot it, most watch nerds will spot it. So you're not fooling anybody that's in the know. But then why buy a Steinhart? Because they're making a case and dial available that has proven to be popular. People like the look of Rolexes, classic and modern. I'm totally fine with people appreciating that. I do think you have to be aware of one thing when considering a Steinhart or similar brands. I think there are two kinds of buyers of these affordable homages. Group one is people that really appreciate these designs and have made the active choice to get a good watch for the price with a design that they like, or maybe even a beta version of the real Rolex that they also own. These people should just keep on going with these purchases. Keep buying them. You like the design, you appreciate it, buy it. The second group are people that are getting their feet wet with their journey into watch collecting. They look at a Steinhart because they are fascinated by Rolex. They look at Stover or Leica because they might be fascinated by something in the IWC collection. I took the route with Stover once, and it ended up being a mistake because they ended up being a stepping stone of wasted money until I took the plunge on the IWC that I actually wanted. Now, lots of people will say, well, Leica and Stover are better, but I personally wanted the IWC, so for me, the Stover ended up being the mistake. I don't think everybody does this, but a lot of you have likely seen, YouTube videos with the title 5 mistakes that every first-time watch collector makes. And the compromise purchase often turns into disappointment at some point, and Steinhart and those brands sometimes lure people and buyers in where you should probably wait until you can afford the watch you actually want. I have to repeat though, there are customers that just like the designs, and there, by all means, go for it. But be careful if it's a compromise purchase. They hardly ever end up scratching the itch the way you want them to. Yes and no. I read an economic report recently. Actually, I read a couple. The short version is this. The US economy and the world economy is actually kind of doing reasonably well. Economic indicators are all going in the right direction. Weirdly, though, people don't feel that it's accurate. The economy is doing, but the fact is people can still see that things cost 25% more than they did 2 years ago. So everybody still remembers what it was like to buy milk, bread, and gasoline for 25% less. Second, salaries have gone up less than 25%. There's a huge disparity between what things cost now and what people used to be able to afford. Now, with an economy that's on the upswing, most economists seem to agree that people's buying power will be back on par with what it was in about 2-3 years' time. That's still a long time for people that have less money in their hands right now. Now translate that to watches. JLC has raised their prices by 30 or 40%. Have definitely priced out their customers in the entry end. Rolex and Omega have raised their prices more consistently and modestly each time around, but they have gone up, taking into account inflation in manufacturing costs and stuff like that. So for them too, the lowest end of entry customers have been priced out in the short term. But we also know that Richemont's watch business has contracted. Pretty much every brand except Rolex has grey market prices that are below MSRP. Discounts are ever so slightly making their way back into ADs for some brands. ADs would rather move stock than get stuck with last year's models. I think this will have the effect that the pace of price increases are going to slow down. The watchmakers got greedy and are realizing that they went too far and money didn't grow on trees, and over the next couple of years we'll see people slowly pricing themselves back into those brands. I don't see any of those brands fundamentally trying to change where they are positioned in the market, except maybe for JLC. I do think they've convinced themselves, JLC specifically, that they should be more high-end, but not Rolex, Omega, IWC, Zenith. They're happy to be where they are from a price perspective, and we'll eventually get back to where we were a couple of years back. My favorite Universal Geneve watch. Honestly, the pole router isn't a watch I'm totally amazed by. I know it has this almost mythical status, but it doesn't speak to me at all. It's like a Piper and Globemaster. It's a nice design, but it's not a design that speaks to me personally. When it comes to their chronos, I think there are a ton of ones that are cool. I like the movement complications. I like the stuff that they did definitely on the high-end kind of complication side of things. But for me, unsurprisingly, like a lot of other people, I think the Nina Rindt is a super, super cool looking watch, and I'd be really interested to see if Breitling could come up with an updated version of that. Why does Rolex stick with their current sizing when everybody else is going smaller? Good question. Because Rolex can sell their watches at their current sizes. Rolex hasn't cared about trend for a long time. Rolex is the kind of brand that could potentially discontinue the Daytona for a period of time if they thought it makes sense. But there are 4 things, totally overcomplicating things, but 4 things that I think you have to consider. 1, their sizes are not accurate. The Daytona in 40 millimeters is actually less than 40 millimeters, and other models are probably a little bit smaller as well than their stated size. So, I haven't bothered with calipers on everything. There are others, YouTubers that have done that, but a lot of the watches are not quite the size that they say. I also think it's a question of proportions. The Black Bay 54 is 37 millimeters, which is 3 millimeters on paper smaller than a sub, but it's only 1.5 millimeters shorter lug to lug. The BB 54 is only half a millimeter in height lower than a Rolex GMT. With 47 millimeters lug to lug, the Submariner isn't too bad. The Sea Dwellers and Sky Dwellers and Yachtmaster 42s are bigger, but generally speaking, the most popular models, the subs, the Daytonas, the Explorers, the GMT, they all wear very close to something like a Black Bay 54 or a Black Bay 58. So wearability-wise, they aren't off in terms of contemporary sizing, despite them on paper being 40-ish millimeters. 3. People haven't gotten thinner or smaller in the last 50 years. I've spoken about this a couple of times. It irritates me every now and again, but this is not just about, the 2000s where everybody liked big watches. I think the reality is the average wrist of the average Rolex buyer is perfectly balanced with a watch the size of the Submariner. Just because the market is trending smaller, I'm still certain that most wrists fit well with a 40 millimeter sub, a GMT or a Datejust. You put it on and it feels right. And no, Brit Pierce wants them smaller, but she's a woman and her wrists are smaller than the average male wrist. Having said that, it makes no sense to me that the Yachtmaster in titanium is 42 millimeters. It should have been 40. It would have been much more popular. Not that it isn't popular, it's going to be hugely popular. 4, 40 millimeter has one strength over 37 millimeters, and that's presence. I do think that Rolex believes that watches need to fit the average Rolex buyer, but they also are aware that their watches need to be big enough to be noticeable. The Rolex brand isn't a discrete brand. You don't wear it and assume nobody will recognize it. I think a little bit of size, a little bit of presence is part of what you buy with Rolex, and having models that are a little bit above contemporary sensibilities sends the signal that Rolex wants to send. On top of all that, I think there's a huge cost related to sizing down in terms of changes in manufacturing, rebalancing dials and all that kind of stuff. Rolex just doesn't move at that pace, so they kind of have to weather the storm and hope the downsizing trend slows down and definitely doesn't continue. Why don't more manufacturers do stringent internal guarantees instead of using COSC or METAS? For those that don't know, COSC, METAS are essentially certifications for Swiss watches that guarantee certain characteristics, so accuracy, anti-magnetic properties, and some other things. Only the Swiss use it. You won't see Nomos, Glashütte, or Seiko using COSC or METAS. The way these certifications works is the manufacturer makes the movement, then they ship it off to COSC, who certifies them either out of the case or in the case or both, and then send them back. There's a cost associated with the certification that the manufacturer pays for. Now, why don't they do that themselves? It boils down to whether you have the technology in-house to do the necessary testing to guarantee the same kind of performance. That's got its own cost associated to it. So, investing in the testing equipment needed, adding those testing processes to your manufacturing process. And then it comes down to also whether your guarantee is as good or more convincing to a consumer as COSC or METAS is. Now, how many consumers stand out at an ADE are swayed by some dealer saying that this one is COSC certified and this one isn't, but they, guarantee it. I think for most manufacturers that currently certify watches through COSC, their business case is that it's too expensive to do the testing themselves, and COSC is too strong a brand to not do it. Only brands like, Rolex, for example, can get away with saying superlative chronometer because their brand is so heavily associated with quality that they don't need to state anything about COSC or METAS anywhere in their sales materials. People just assume that Rolexes are accurate. Do I have a favorite time only or time and date movement? I'm not a movement buff. I'm much more of a dial man. It's not often I worry about a display case back or hand engraving and all those internal things. Having said that, I've seen enough Langers and Glashütte originals to really appreciate the workmanship that goes into those kind of movements. When it comes to time only, though, there is one movement that consistently sticks out as one I thought was jaw-dropping. Also, I'm limiting myself to a watch that I've seen in the metal, and that's the Chopard XPS Officer 1850, 1860 something. I actually tried to buy it once, and I didn't know how popular it was, and I didn't know it was a limited edition. I had the money and had saved up by moving some stuff around in my collection, but it wasn't to be. It was like there's 250 pieces of them or something like that. So maybe someday, but probably never, because I don't really wear dress watches, so it would probably be a mistake anyway. Explorer 40 versus IWC Mark 20. IWC Mark 20 every day and twice on Sundays. I don't consider myself a Rolex fanboy, but I'm also not a Rolex hater. I own Rolex watches and they are impeccable quality. They're well designed and most, if not all, of their models are iconic. But I've owned the 214270, the 39mm version, and I ended up selling it after less than a year. I never wore the thing. I thought the story, the legacy of the mountaineering and Everest and all that appealed to me, but it just never found its way to my wrist. Fortunately, I sold it with a little bit of a profit because it is, after all, a Rolex, and I ended up buying a blue-dialed Pilot's Mark 20, and I wear that watch all the time. To me, it's just a better looking watch. I think it's more interesting to look at, it has more character, and it's more versatile. Bracelet on the Mark 20 is excellent, and from a functionality perspective, it's just more visually appealing to me. The thing that sets the IWC over the top for me is that it transitions better from dressy to casual to tool than the Explorer. Just the simple fact that on the IWC you can clip on and off the bracelet and the straps means I can grab it in the morning, I don't need any tools, and I just put on whatever I need. That makes it so much more convenient. Then also, because the Explorer has gold plots, it just feels more premium, and I don't feel it can pull off the tool vibe nearly as well as the IWC. It does luxury really, really well. It also does dress fairly well, but as a tool, it just doesn't do that well. The older vintage Explorers can do that, but the newer Explorers and the Explorer 39 that I had, and the Explorer 40 for that matter, can't to the same extent. And that's a general problem with a lot of modern Rolex models. They just don't look particularly toolish because that's not what Rolex is going for. Notable exception would, of course, be the Explorer 2, which I own, and you can see the link up here. Put all those things together and I have a watch that is quicker to change in terms of style and has a broader range of use cases, and then I really dig planes and airplanes and sort of history of Luftwaffe and the RAF and World War I and World War II and all that kind of stuff, so IWC just speaks to me more. Below $2,000, which 3 brands would I choose? I made a video about good brands up here. Definitely consider watching that. I think if I had to limit myself to 3 brands, then I would include brands that have some level of variety in addition to quality. If the brand makes only one type of watch, let's just say, like just dress watches, I think I'd get bored and feel a little bit limited. So although, someone like Studio Underdog or Unimatic are super cool, I think having them in a max 3 pool would be too limiting in the short term. I want options down the road. Again, we're not talking about 3 watches, we're talking about 3 watch brands. So I have a soft spot for Seiko below $2,000. A lot of their SPB models are good looking. There's a lot of variety. They're technically competent. You also have the 5 series. And it's Seiko's. They have history. They're technically solid. It's just, they know what they're doing. They would have me covered for basically dive watches and toolish watches. My second brand would probably be Nomos. There are high-end models like the sports club models, which are over $2,000, but for under $2,000, you get basic clubs, Orions, Tangentes, all simple, elegant, dressy, casual watches. They cover a wide range, lots of variety, and you still, to this day, get a lot for your money. The last brand would be Casio. I think that would be self-explanatory why. I know I just made a video on how micro brands are super cool, and now I just mentioned 3 that are not micro brands at all. So if I had to limit myself to micro brands or smaller brands, these are likely the ones I'd go for. I would swap out Nomos with Fera. I would swap out Casio with Zin. And Seiko, I think I might swap out with Doxa or Formex. Mass-produced luxury, is that an oxymoron? I get it. Luxury, to some extent, does not equate with mass production. Selling 1.2 million watches like Rolex does, to some, feel like something other than luxury. But it comes down to how you define luxury. Adrian Barker had a cool description of it. He said accessibility, quality, and cost. So if you can't get it, it's well made and it's expensive, then it's luxury. I think that's a pretty good definition. There's also the Oxford Dictionary definition, which I'm not going to read out because that's kind of cliche. But the question is also, can you link mass production and luxury? Can you do that? Well, Mercedes S-Class is hyper luxurious. It's got more or less everything a Bentley has in terms of quality, and it's mass produced. I think you would find most people would describe an S-Class Merc as a luxury vehicle. I think you can find a lot of examples with bicycles to golf clubs to espresso machines that most people would define as luxury items. As a general rule, most people would likely assume that anything mass produced is going to be available by default. And if it's available, well, then technically you can't see it as a luxury by Adrian's definition. On the other hand, you have Rolex, where they clearly mass produced, but also in a large part unavailable. Same with Omega and the 321 Speedy. That would make them luxury again. Your second problem is cost. Who defines what's expensive? Some Seikos and Casios for less than $4,000 were sold out more or less instantly when they were launched. Since they're inaccessible, they must be luxuries. But is the cost high enough to be deemed as luxury? Well, that again depends on who you are. If you're looking down from a pile of money like Jeff Bezos, well, then very few things are going to be inaccessible and very few things are going to be expensive. You will likely think that most people's definition of luxury is going to be too broad, and other people will likely see what you see as a necessity as being too broad a definition. You can't live without caviar in the morning. It's a necessity. But calling a Rolex Oyster Perpetual a luxury is just not accurate in your mind when you're that rich. But if you have no money, well, then food is a necessity. A roof over your head is a luxury. I know I'm describing extremes, but that's kind of the key for me. With the differences in income and wealth, your definitions are going to vary wildly. And if they vary wildly, then we have at least one last discussion. Do you subscribe to the position that luxury is something that is defined broadly, by society or a group of people? So, some sort of global objective definition, or is it described by the individual? Personally, I subscribe to it being an individual definition. I decide what I see as luxury, not some grouping of other people. If it's luxury to you, then it's luxury to you. And if a Patek is a necessity to you, then you have way too much money. Thanks again for getting me all the way past 10,000 subscribers. Your support is hugely appreciated, and I really value how all of you contribute to the community, from those of you that have been here since the very beginning to those that have just joined. I'll do my very best to keep making videos you find worthy of your time. For those of you that are new, thank you also for dropping by. Leave a comment, join in the conversation, and please consider clicking that subscribe button. It's, as always, massively appreciated. And thanks for this time. As always, like, subscribe. Cheers.